So I guess it's 12:15, so let's get started. I feel like a rock star up here. I got so much light in my face, I have no idea what, but I see at least Cheryl's in the front. So I think there are more people in the back. Let's get this show started. And first of all, and this is my fault. Initially, we were supposed to talk about the Leap-in transposase platform. So for those of you who saw that banner out there with that title, you will be very disappointed. It's not going to happen. It's going to be, I think, 2 slides at the very end about the transposon. For those who looked at the monitor out there, there's a completely different title, and that's the real title. It's more about how we use machine learning to build better biotherapeutics. Okay. So, once upon a time, 2003, in a small town not too far away from here, Menlo Park, California. So at the time there were 4 of us, had some ideas around utilizing the machine learning that we saw coming out of smart people like the Googles and the PayPals of the world, and how they manipulate data, how they optimize data, and combine that with synthetic biology that allows us to make any given sequence you can think of. So we can then apply the same underlying machine learning rules from Google and how to find your, correlate your click profile to if you're going to be sold car insurance or whatever it is, and combine that with how to build better antibodies or build better enzymes or other things. So that was the kernel of the company. I'll talk about how we enforced that and how we built upon that to make Atom what it is today. So just quick, for those who don't know, we're based in beautiful San Francisco Bay Area, where the sun always shines, except this morning. So today we are around 160 employees. One thing I do, I collect publications where customers reference us for getting access to genes or proteins or whatever. And that's, at this point, around 3,000 publications. Having said that, almost 90% of those publications are from academics. And if I look at my inbox, I'd say probably less than 10% of our customers are academics. So it gives you a little bit of correlation of that weight. So we're heavily science focused. For the longest time, we had a rule never to hire anyone with an MBA, never hire anyone with a law degree, just get science geeks in a room. And we failed on that premise, but to this day, we're very science-driven, so we have at this point, I think, 34 issued patents, and really science-driven in everything we do, and try to implement a lot of these machine learning tools across the company. We acquired a company called MIGS back in 16, and we changed the name from Atom to DNA 2.0. So from DNA 2.0 to Atom, I think there's still someone with a name tag of DNA 2.0 in the team, so he's still with us. He was not fired in 16. And the other thing we're doing, we really focus on bespoke biology. So we're building biology for you, and these may be genes, they may be proteins, they may be cell lines, but the point is, these are all driven by providing services to the company. So we, at this point, have not a single penny from outside investors. That means that everything we do is focused on making sure that you are provided enough value that you're willing to give us a PO number that supports that, right? So that means we have to be profitable every single quarter, basically every single day, which is very different from many of our competitors. And then, as you see, this beautiful building, we are now 100% solar on that building. So as of just a few weeks ago, we now have a marketing person, and she convinced me that it's okay to brag. I'm born and bred Swede. As a Swede, if you brag, that's somewhere that's close to, somewhere between, pillage and murder. But so my Swedish passport will probably be revoked after this, but let me brag a little bit about what we've been doing. So I think we have a long history of doing machine learning for biology. And within the company of the founders, started first paper was already in 93, which is probably half the crowd here wasn't even born at that time. So that's just grumpy old man perspective. Using machine learning at that time to build E. coli promoters. And since then, we published a lot of papers across the field for making proteins, making genes, making metabolic operons, making cell lines. And as we've been publishing all these different things over the years, just building on that technology and that platform that we've been establishing, right? So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen the pros and cons of the different approaches of doing this. So what we do fundamentally is, I think of the company as two axes. One axis is the manufacturing axis. This is gene synthesis. So we can make any gene you can think of, we can make any protein you can think of, and you can make any cell line you can think of, as a function of just doing synthetic biology, right? So then, if you can make anything you can think of course, the counter question is, what is worthwhile thinking of? So that's when we bring in the machine learning, right? Because how do you design, how do you search this large space, and how do you optimize for different properties? So back in the days, and some of you may remember, Eric certainly remembers, we used to make all these libraries for people, including Adimab. And so we had all these people requesting libraries from us. And not to go into all the complexities, but I had this one European customer who came in and said they wanted to have, look at all the CDRs, so 1, 2, 3, and they want to have all 20 options at every position in that library, right? So it seems like and then they want to use that as their master library and then use that to search everything, right? To conquer the world. Fantastic. So we sat down and tried to talk them out of it, but they were dead set on doing it this way. So just at the back of the envelope calculation, right? So if you think about that, so if you say a CDR is on average 10 amino acids long, you got 20 amino acids in every one of those, so that's the 3 CDRs. So you end up with 10 to the 39, so 20 to the 30, 10 to the 29 unique sequences, 10 to the 39 unique sequences. Now that's a lot, that's a big number, so let's divide it by Avogadro's constant to make it into moles. Still quite a few moles, right? 10 to the 15 moles. Now let's assume, because we're so fantastic, we can make everything you can think of. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, we can make one single unique CDR by PCR amplification. So we'll make a library that is perfectly equimolar. Right? Every single sequence is as one instance. Of course, that's a tough task to make, but let's say for the sake of argument. So we're making now PCR amplification, and just not the whole cloning, not the whole antibodies, just that CDR. So let's say I'm 500 amino acids, and times this. So this becomes now quite a bit of DNA, right? So this, and just from the context that all of us have been in the lab, we've been standing having a little Eppendorf, and you flicker that little thing, you see that tiny speck of dirt barely floating around. We see that as a lot of DNA. That is not a lot of DNA compared to what you're looking for. So here we're looking at metric tons, right? So look at 5 to the power of 14 metric tons of DNA to make this happen. So of course, how much is that? That's a lot. So just for comparison, we can talk about the ultra-large crude carriers, ULCC. I've learned this fairly recently now. It turns out they can take almost 500,000 metric tons in one of those things. So those are huge. These are massive, massive large things, right? But we need 1 billion ULCCs to do this transportation over to Europe. So the first thing I need to talk to this European customer about, FedEx is not going to accept this order. So how are we going to take this sample and ship that before we even start talking about QC and all that sort of stuff, right? Sequence space is very, very large. So how do we even navigate that? How do we search that space? How do we find promoters, and how do we find antibodies that are consistent with this massively, massively large space? And of course, the absolute majority of this massively large space is going to be empty, which is going to be death. Okay, so this is how we do it, right? So it comes down to two things. It comes down to variable selection. How do you know which amino acids to play with, to substitute in? And then how to search. How do you combine the best single amino acids into the ones that have epistatic effects that makes for a better antibody or a better whatever it is. And then the third point, what is better? How do you define better? Is it better binding? Is it better at curing cancer? Is it better for less aggregation, or all of the above, right? So basically 2 buckets, variable selection and search. and then whatever assays you want to put on to make that fit. So just to get variable selection out of the way, and I know these are blurry with an intent. This is from a customer order, so that's why it's not supposed to be crystal clear. But what we do is basically we look at all the antibodies that Mother Nature already provided, and certainly the ones that are available in GenBank and other public domain places. And now, increasingly, there are a lot of these things coming online, so there are plenty of antibodies out there that you can look at. So we can then look at by germline, and just blast against all the possible germlines, see what's available. We look at the epitope design for immunogenicity. We look at we can visualize, you have a lot of structural properties now with AlphaFold. You can do a lot of assumptions based off structure, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into this whole universe all by itself, but suffice to say, we use this as a screening tool. We use basically rank order an infinite number of amino acid substitutions based off of how they fit within all these different measures of presence in biology. So that gives us down a long, long list of amino acid substitutions, and then the question is, how do you search that for maximum efficiency? So this is where we use, design, build, test, right? So we use systematic variance, design of experiments, which is a great way to look at multiple variables simultaneously. And everyone who's done process chemistry and things like that, you do a lot of DOE, design of experiments. So we use the same underlying math to search space, and I'll get into it a little bit how we do that, and to systematically vary all these substitutions in a defined space. And then, being a synthetic biology company, we just make them, fine. And then once you have them made, now you can do the real world assay, right? So the point here is, how can you measure things that are as close as possible to the real commercial endpoint assay? Why do you care about binding when you truly care about, does it neutralize the virus or not? Why do you care about, if it makes some marker green, when you truly care about, does it aggregate or not, right? So let's figure out a low throughput, high quality assay that truly reflects what you care about. So we measure that using the biology. And then once we have that data, now we have input data, we have output data, we can build machine learning models, and I'm sure we just got back from PEGS Europe in Barcelona, and I think there were like 5 or 6 or 7 talks about using machine learning for engineering antibodies. It's like the hip thing, so I'm sure many of you went to those same talks. But basically, just classic model building machine learning. Here you go. So what does that mean, right? So the way we do it, and everyone's got their own little flavors of this, the way we do it is, imagine this as a massively large matrix, but what we actually end up doing in the lab are just making 96 sequences. So this is now in the top left corner of this big matrix where you have 96 rows, and you have maybe 70 columns, and that basically implies what are the substitutions that you're using across your 96 antibodies. And we use 96 only because, hey, welcome to biology. Everything is built for 96 well plates, right? So it's just, had someone at some point did 100 well plate, my life would be a lot easier and everything would be nice and metric, but it's not. So we'll do 96. And once we have that, then we can look at the output variable. So what is the yield? What is the PK value, on rate, off rate, whatever measure you want to do, right? So now, and once you have that, well, you got a model. You can do just classic machine learning. Okay, so here's just a case study where we optimized an antibody. We had a starting point that was a commercial antibody that was been on the market for 10 or so years. The customer wanted something that behaved better. We'll get into that in a little bit. And so we went through this and we're certainly not going to start with making a large 10 to the 39 library because of the reasons I just discussed. But we had some ideas and we had identified substitutions that were interesting. So what you see here is that 41 substitutions in the heavy chain and 36 substitutions in the light chain that looked interesting. So that space ends up being 10 to the 23 for those who do math, which is still a large space. Don't get me wrong, it's still a very large space. So what we do is we just make 96 sequences. So what you're looking at here on the blue side, which is round 1, so every column is one antibody sequence. So what you see, every blue dot means that there's a substitution. So the very first variant number 1, column number 1, has no substitutions at all in the light chain, but has 3 or 4 substitutions in the heavy chain, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the second half, all the substitutions are sitting in the light chain. We make these, we test them, we measure all the different properties that we care about, and then based off of that machine learning, we can then build and identify the substitutions that are bad, just kill them, get rid of them, toss them. All the ones that are good, we keep them, we love them, we nurture them, and we'll bring them on to the next round. So that's what you see going from round 1, which is blue, to round, let's call it 2, that is pink. So what you see, some substitutions are now locked in because they're great. Some substitutions are completely gone. Those are just blacked out, so that means that substitution was garbage, let's kill it. And then you have all these substitutions that it flickers back and forth because now we're exploring that space. So based off of that fairly simple and small experiment, we only did 186 full-length antibodies. Now we can, based off of that model and measurements, we can now, first of all, we can get measures for every single one of those substitutions. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. So that's how good versus how bad each substitution is. So you see that guy up in the corner, far up there, he's great. Right? So you see 0 means that those are neutral. Do we have? We do not have. But trust me on this. You see a 0, that means they're neutral. Everything that's below the 0 on the left graph, that's garbage. Everything that's above the 0 is great. That's a good thing. The other thing is that you see error bars, and that's because we do bootstrapping. So we make the machine learning model, and everyone is interested in more in the technical, come talk to us at our booth, which has a number, 301, thank you. Come to the booth 301 for more details. But basically what we do is we do bootstrapping, meaning we model the data on 80%, we toss out, hide 20% from the computer, model on the 80, project back into 20, and then we scramble that and do that maybe 1,000 times. So that means you get new data all the time, and that's what you see as the error bar. So that's a function of the epistatic effect of that amino acid substitution. And then on the right-hand side is the actual model. So what you see in pink, that's the total data set, and what you see in blue that's the cross val. So meaning we take out 20% and project that back in, right? And the more nicely diagonal that model is, the better is your data, and the higher is your predictability. So again, going back to the case study we did, so we look at here we're looking at binding on the x-axis. So here I put it as Ka, just because people like to see things go a high number being good, but it's just for graphic purposes. And then on the y-axis, we are looking at titer. And then the coloring scheme, we're looking at TM, right? So what we want is, so we have the parent in the top left corner, meaning it has a good titer, but we want to increase the binding, right? And it's red, meaning it's high TM. And then based off of these 186 sequences, we find 3 sequences that are improved, significantly improved, and these are the ones we cherry-picked off of those 186. And then you see the underlying data of how they fit in the titer, in the TM, and the binding versus the parent, right? So this is how we can use only 184 sequences to search this 10 to the 23 space, right? Because we're using DOE, we're using systematic variance, and we're using synthetic biology to validate that data set. And the whole point of the system is like, how can you capture as much data as possible from as few measurements as possible, right? How can you get as big as bang as possible for your buck, right? So that's the whole point. Now, this is just TM and yield and binding, but of course, in reality, there are all these other features that you care about in an antibody, right? So here you're looking at our typical developability pipeline, and you can optimize for any of these sequences or any of these properties, and build your machine learning models accordingly, right? And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but in principle, all these properties are engineerable in parallel, not serially, but you can do this all in parallel because you can measure these things in a systematic way. So here's another case study, a separate case study from the first one, where we looked at a molecule. And what you see here is now, I think, 8 different features that this customer was interested in optimizing for, right? So now if we look at each variable, so each variable is 1 amino acid substitution, right? And now I'm taking out the epistatic effects just to simplify the argument. So imagine every single one of these bars also has an error bar on it, but let's not go there at this time. So that means that each of these amino acid substitutions, so variable 1 through 48, are good for certain things and bad for certain things, right? There you can have something that's great. So you look at, for instance, the far left one. So it's kind of neutral for everything except, I think, on rate is really bad or something. But most of that is white noise, and so on and so forth across all these substitutions, right? So now this starts to look really hairy because you have all these different properties for all these different. How do you search that space? Well, it turns out it's much, much simpler than you anticipate, right? So what we can do, in this case, we just went back to the customer and say, give me a measure of how important each of these properties are, right, from a business standpoint. So they came back and said, we brought in the MBAs. So they're allowed at this point, we bring in a few MBAs in the room, but keep them under control. And then they say, well, property number one is 6 times as important as property number 2 from a commercial standpoint. And then we just said, okay, fine, let's just do simple math, like elementary school math, right? Let's multiply each of those impacts against all of these different fitness functions. And now, very simple elementary school math. Now you look at each of these variables, and what you see is that the first 5 or so are kind of neutral. You see variable number 28 is miserable, right? You kill that one for sure. Never want to use that variable again. Whereas variable number 36 is fantastic. Let's make sure that one is in, and then iterate through that, right? So, and not only that, but you can then take this data. So now this is the integrated, in this case, just simple addition, right, or multiplication for the impact for each of these variables. And you can make that into a machine learning model, which we look at on the top right side, where you have the calculated fitness, which is just multiplying the importance versus each of these features. And then you have the predicted fitness on the y-axis. So this is now just a classic old school machine learning model. And again, you're looking at cross-val in blue, and you're looking at, looking at the total data in blue, and you're looking at the cross-val in red. So that gives you a feeling for how much of epistatic effect you have across this data set. But this is my favorite slide. I love this slide. This is the slide I wake up in the morning. This makes me happy. This is a happy slide. Because now you can really build all these highly complex biological systems in one user interface, so to say, or one approach. So here's something we did with, this is not an antibody. This is, just to clarify, this is with a company called Chr. Hansen. This is for making the cheese that some of you may be eating right now. I haven't checked, but my assumption, so I think 70% of the world's cheeses are made with a chymosin that we designed. So this is Chr. Hansen, had one of the world's largest producer of chymosin. So chymosin is the enzyme that breaks down the milk proteins to make it coagulate and make cheese. So we engineered that for them. You see the wild type pointed at a little arrow in the far and sort of the bottom side. So here we optimized for proteolysis, which is cleaving that milk protein, clotting, how fast does the cheese actually clot as a function of this protein, expression, because they make this in a fungus somewhere, weird expression system, and then because it's a protease, you also get background cleavage of this unwanted peptide A, which gives it a bitter aftertaste for the cheese. So in cheese world, that's bad. And of course, taste, right? So how do you measure taste? Well, it turns out Chr. Hansen, they have, and I don't know if there's any Danes in this room, but they have 10 certified cheese tasters. I love this. It's my dream job. When I retire from Adam, I'm going to be a certified cheese taster at Chr. Hansen. So they sit in a room and they taste cheeses. And they get a little slice and they say, this one is bitter, but has a nice flavor to it, and so on and so forth. But the point being, this is an extremely low throughput, high quality assay, right? There's no way you can do this with 10 to the 2 is a massive nightmare, but you can do it for 10 different cheeses, right? So here we ended up making this, the total space we're looking at in this particular project ended up being 10 to the 25, which is of course a massively large space. But we only searched 300 variants And we optimize for all these different properties. And this molecule is today, 70% of the world's cheeses are made using this enzyme. So allow you then to design and build specifically the molecule you want. So the last 2-3 slides, I'm just going to talk through about how we implement that in the system of ADAM and how we build that into the stable integrants and deliver that as master cell banks. So if you make an antibody, if we make an antibody for you, we can then engineer it to fulfill all these different properties that we care about or that you care about. And because we're only talking about the little protein engineering slice of the company at this talk right here, but upstream of that, we have the whole gene synthesis and the gene process part. And downstream, we have the cell line division. So the cell line process is really built around this fantastic little transposase that we pulled out of Mother Nature. Actually, initially came from the African claw frog. It's not pink in reality, but let's pretend for visuals, it's a pink claw frog. And of course, transposase has been around a long time, 4 billion years. And people a lot smarter than us pulled this out of biology, Nobel Prize '83. And it's basically just an enzyme that cuts DNA and moves that DNA, right? So now we engineer that, and we took, using the platform I just described, the previous 20 or so slides, we build a transposase that is 500-fold more efficient than the natural one, and then allows us then to build cell lines that can introduce a massive number or 20, 30, up to 100 copies of your gene of interest into the chromosome, massively stable. And the cool thing with that is, of course, because you're integrating them as a bicatalysis event, instead of when most people do is random integration, when you make it using the leap-in transposase, these things the entire pool becomes very stable. So here you're looking at, if you look at clones where you introduce this, and you rank order them by yield, what you see is, if you do random integration, anyone who's doing this, you know you have to go through 10 plates, 20 plates, 50 plates of clones, right? So thousands and thousands of clones to find something that's decent, right? Because most everything is garbage. But there are going to be a few nuggets of gold in there. Whereas with a leap-in, basically all of them are really, really good. So because you have a nice uniform distribution of your genes of interest across it. So that gives you screen much, much fewer clones. You get highly predictive clonal productivity. All the PTMs, the glycans, the this, that, and everything are going to be highly predictive based off of what you actually introduce as the pool. That means you can speed up your process, you can de-risk your process, you never have to go through all these clonal processes to identify the best ones. And this, of course, has massive implications, not only antibodies, but all the bispecific, trispecifics, IgMs, all these weird molecules that cytokine fusion things. And that gives us then, we can go straight from gene syn through optimization, through process, and have that into a stable cell line in 10 to 12 weeks. And now, as of 2 months ago, we now also have our own GM master cell banking in-house. Now, this has a lot of numbers and classification schemes. I have no idea what these things mean, but there are smarter people than me that lives and dies by these CFR part 210 numbers and all that. But and that's the way it should be. So, meaning we can now pull this all the way through master cell banking before it goes out to a large-scale production. And then, is this successful? I would say so. This is out of the best possible marketing is when people who are not in your company is bragging about how cool this is. So this is a paper in Boehringer Ingelheim. This is a COVID era. They brought this GMP manufacturing within 3 months from transfection to first in human, right? And this is pulled straight out of their paper. Manufacturing of MABs was achieved at a pace never reached before within our organization, and to the best knowledge, even within the pharma industry. Of course, now that's well established, accepted fact. For the transposon process, we filed this now in 3 different jurisdictions, so Europe, US, China. I think there are 20. I don't know if we have any new updates on that. Last I checked, it was 20 IND filings. We have 40, 50 active licensees using this. 50% of the top 20 pharma is using this and delivered on a number of different projects. So on that, I know I had a full hour, but I promised someone that would be too rude of a Monday morning to give you a full hour of Atom. But if you want more, there's plenty of us in booth 301. Thank you very much. And my email's right there. I try to answer every single email that people send me. So thank you very much. Any questions? Yep.
How do you decide on which residue positions and what residues mutations to test out?
Yeah, so that's a whole seminar all by itself. Let's go back to that slide. Your big question. This is it's a very big question. So this is basically the answer to that. Like bunch of stuff, right? So what we do is we take all the databases that we can find, get our hands on, and then we sort them based on everything we can sort them on. And then over the years, now we've done this now, company's been around for 20, we're gonna have a huge party in a few months where we celebrate our 20th year. So we've been doing this for 20 years. And one thing we started doing, basically giving everything, basically equi-weight for all the different properties. And over time, we've seen that certain features are more important, certain features are less important, certain features are actually negative, which then you can turn that around and use it any which way. And then just basically mining all that data, not only from the public domain, but also what we have sitting internally. But no, yeah, that's a can of worms that we can get into at some point. But feel free to pop by.
Thank you.
Yeah, please do. This is the part I like. I mean, I heard this talk before, so I prefer this. Okay, question.
For this decision-making process, is that just a matter of your manual sort of experience over the years, or do you actually have some model that's trained on all of your data that kind of tells you which residues you should mutate?
Yeah, so I don't know if everyone heard, but the question is, are we doing this manual, going through all this data set manually, or are we going through it completely automated? And the truth is somewhere in between. I think that over the years, we started doing it manually, and over the years, we've been building so much data. We're a tiny company, we're 160 people, but we have maybe 12 or so full-time programmers, data mining people, that kind of. So one of the big differentiators, and one thing we focus a lot on, is building an underlying LIMS. And I didn't go into that at all, but that's a whole. That's yet another. That's for my database presentation. But when we started the company, we pulled out a LIMS from off the shelf, and it was a complete nightmare. It didn't work. It was just so bad. And then we ended up trying to build it through a consultant, some company in India. It was just a disaster again. So in the end, we said we were sitting here in Silicon Valley. We're up there in Silicon Valley. So we just started hiring programmers. And it's been a long and tedious and expensive process. But it's amazing now when we have all this data and all these different layers, and all the way from chemistry, doing oligonucleotide chemistry, to build all these different oligos, all the way out now to stable cell lines and how looking at different stuff that goes on the master cell banking. All across that, it's all integrated in one massive underlying LIMS. And of course, I'm biased. This is the most, well, I've seen pictures, I haven't seen the actual thing, from Amgen's. Apparently they've got a fantastic LIMS as well. I don't know if there's Amgen people here, but so that looked beautiful on PowerPoint. I don't know how it works, what it works in reality. This is the second best LIMS I've seen in my entire life, after the Amgen one. Yes?
If you compare the random integration versus the target disposal technology
Yep.
for the fast winners of the cell line development, do you see a difference, or they tend to be the same because you select the fast?
Yeah, so let's go there. So this thing, right? So there are basically two ways to. lots of ways to make stable integrants. But the two ways talked about here. One is random integration, which basically what you do is you take DNA and you have some selectable marker, and you toss it onto the cell and hope for the best. Or you can do with transposon. Now it's a bicatalytic event, so you have an enzyme that captures the ends of that integration sequence and inserts it across the genome. So, of course, I'm going to say this leap-in transposon is much, much better. But I think the argument is fairly solid in the sense that this is a bicatalytic event. If you do random integration, by definition, you are selecting for sequences that are in the genome that are unstable, because by definition, that's where you're going to get an integrant of DNA. So you're selecting for garbage integration points. And that's why you see all these truncations and concatenators and all this stuff that you typically see when you do random integration. And that's why you get all this instability as well, but partly because you're integrating in an unstable piece of DNA, and partly because you're getting duplicates, triplicates, these massive concatenators, and it spits out itself and so on and so forth. Whereas if you do it with a bicatalytic event, the transposon evolved for doing this for 4 billion years. I think I was talking to some transposon scientists, and they say that 20% of my genome, and I'm sure your genome as well, is all transposon derived one way or the other. These things are incredibly successful. They're from an evolutionary standpoint, they have 4 billion years of success of being really, really good at integrating in places where they are stable, because that's kind of how evolution works. So that gives them a very high degree of stability, multiple insertion points in the same genome, and then that allows you then to de-risk your entire process all the way up front. So I hope that answers your question.
One of the factors, the variables that you're looking at for developability is expression levels. And do you use only your own cell lines, or do you have the capability to do other custom cell lines?
Yeah, so cell line question. So do we have our own cell line, or do we do other? Most of the stuff we've done to this point is using the Horizon cell line. Having said that, we have our own cell line, Mike showed. We also work with, and typically what often happens is a licensing question. It's really questions of who you want to pay cash to in the end, right? So if you have as a customer, a lot of customers come in, they already have a license to the Lonza cell line or a Merck cell line or whatever it is, and we're happy to work with anything. And these things leap in. Transposons are incredibly generic. This thing doesn't care. He goes into JERCAT, he or she, right? Goes into JERCAT cells, primary T cells, whatever. The limitation is really getting through the membrane, right? And then this thing goes into Saccharomyces cerevisiae, right? So anything you feed it, as long as it's got a ligase and as long as it's eukaryotic, transposons happy to work with it. But the second part of your question then of what cell lines, I assume what do you recommend or which one do you go with? Whatever the customer wants, that's the one we use. Welcome to capitalism, right? Whoever's got the PO number, that's the one who makes the rules. And I don't have the PO number. Yes?
So, would you suspect that the transposon actually prefers to leap into transcribed genes, since they would not be in, condensed chromatin? Not only is there the potential that places that likely to go for, random integrations where the chromosomes break from not stop.
Yeah. So the question is, what's the integration specificity of the transposase? What we see is, first of all, it requires TTAA. Now, fairly obvious, there are plenty of TTAAs in the CHO genome, more than you can shake a stick at. But it also requires open chromatin, right? So what we tend to see is that it typically integrates in open chromatin, but away from actively transcribed operons. Having said that, we sequence probably a few hundred integration sites at this point. And I think as far as I know, we've never seen the same integration site twice. So we call it semi-targeted or semi-random, whatever you want to call it, from whichever angle you come at it. Right? Basically, but it likes open chromatin, it likes TTAA, and it likes stable DNA. Yes. Yeah.
Are you considering use resistant for the cell therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's transposons are just, I mean, it's a fantastic little tool, right? So if we can, I think there's some issues by having random or semi-random or semi-targeted integration. There's going to be some issues from a clinical standpoint of using that as a gene therapy application. I think those are solvable problems. I think it's biology. We can engineer it, right? We can just, and so I think those are all solvable issues. The question then, of course, comes into like all gene therapy applications. You know, what are the risks for off-target integration, and all that sort of things? But absolutely, this is a very nice little tool to slot in any DNA into a genome. And I think at the end of the day, we jumped on this because we started looking at CRISPR to make stable cell lines. And of course, there are two issues with CRISPR. Of course, number one is there are more lawyers than there are scientists working on CRISPR. So that's a bad place to start. And the second thing is that fundamentally, CRISPR is a knockout tool, whereas transposons are a knock-in tool, right? So, and then we saw that there were hardly any lawyers working on any transposase work. So much more freedom to operate was orders of magnitude better. So that was really the driver. Eric?
First of all, as a happy customer, I didn't realize it was 20 years ago, so thank you for being so committed.
Well, they might have party.
Yeah, I mean, it's Adamat would have never been a company if you guys hadn't done what you did at Great Artists Libraries. So
Thank you.
just incredibly amazing what you were able to do back then. Question, you get excited about certain POs, like, you know, the PO gets it, but there must be ones that fit the machine learning where you like kind of see it and you're like, wow, that's a perfect question for this answer. What's the, if we're sitting out here and thinking about what projects are the best fit?
So I think that the more hairy, the more complicated, the more low throughput, high quality assays you need to do, the more important it is to do to capture as much value as possible per measurement. Right? So if you just want to make an antibody for diagnostic purposes, something that binds, hey, maybe not my mom, but my aunt could probably do a phage display library and pull something out that has a decent binding, or inject something to that. It's not that complicated. But if you want to do, or you make one, if you want to make a new fluorescent protein, and that's not easy. But if you want to make something that's truly low throughput, high quality assay, and the assay is something that you can make, it's like the cheese, I think is a fantastic example, right? How are you going to do a 10 to the 9 cheese assay? It's just not going to happen, because you need to, every single cheese, you need to make it uniquely, and you actually have people who taste it, which is looking at the primer data, the error bar is fairly significant for cheese tasting. Right? So if you have 10 certified cheese tasters, it's not going to, they are surprisingly good, but still, it's not going to be on the line. So I think the more complicated, the lower throughput the assay, the more important it is to really take advantage of the machine learning in order to maximize all these different properties as a function of what you're trying to engineer.
And what was it implied there? You're coming with at least your first hit or two. It's not just a target. It's you've got something that works sort of.
Yeah.
You want the real bias.
Exactly. I think so when you do biology engineering, I think there are two buckets. One is just first you got to go fishing, right? First you got to find a solution that has a level of activity that's above the level of detection. So you have a signal, and that's a whole different. We're not better or worse than anyone else doing that. Right? Everyone sometimes it's shooting fish in a barrel, and sometimes it's just to have no idea what's going on. But then once you have that starting point, you have a measurable starting point. Then to actually engineer it towards something that's improved, that's when the machine learning comes in. Absolutely. And then you can of course address that two ways. You can do either you can lower the level of detection of your assay, so you have but then are you really measuring what you care about, or you measure some surrogate assay that is just indirectly reflect what you care about, and that leads you down all sorts of different levels. Yes.
You mentioned that code is very predictive with saliva.
Yeah.
Based on your experience, I wonder if you can comment on the course behavior performance of the versus the saliva code in terms of are they on the same ballpark?
Oh, they're very similar. I mean, amazingly similar. Yeah, that's. Please come by our booth and we can talk
probably hours on that, but absolutely. Cheryl, make sure you got it. But yeah, so it's amazingly how similar the pool versus the final clone is, and that's why why you had Boehringer were able to go directly from the pool into first in man using the LeapLink platform, because they showed and had the data to support that the pool derived material was basically superimposable directly off of the final clone study. And you're all free to go, but if I'll be hanging around here, so please, very nice to see you. This is what I love to do. This is the fun part, is having the questions afterwards. As I said, I've seen the talk before, so that is kind of done. So hope you appreciate your lunch.